surrender.
What must a president believe about us, about America? That she is worth protecting? That liberty is priceless? Our people honorable? Our future prosperous, remarkable, and free? John McCain, the American president Americans have been waiting for.
Right, so somebody can run for president in this conservative reality just citing their quote-unquote Americanness. Now obviously this is constructed to tap into the questions, the ridiculous questions and rumor mongering about Barack Obama and his multi-ethnic heritage, et cetera, but the point here is that nationalism really makes a resurgence in this conservative outcome. And it goes deeper. More race baiting, more NAFTA.
I know NAFTA was a good idea. It's created millions of jobs. And
the same status quo. And the polls show that America is at best divided over these outcomes. Here's a progressive reality, that if we do what we need to do to make this uprising work for progressives, this, I think, are some legitimate expectations. A new foreign policy, universal health care, public economic investment, reform trade policy, a labor resurgence, strong public support for these outcomes. And I think that there are three major changes that suggest that these progressive outcomes are actually more likely, although my book basically says it's not clear what's going to come out of this. The first, this is a poll of confidence in institutions. Congress was at 34% in that last uprising. Today, 14%. The presidency, major decline in the confidence in the institution of the presidency. Now, if I just showed you these lines, I'd say we're in really big trouble. Because the conservatives' anti-government rhetoric is going to tap right into this. But here's where I think we have an advantage. This is business, big business. People's confidence in big business back in that last uprising was 1 in 3 said they had confidence. Now just 18%. Similarly, banks, roughly two-thirds of Americans said they had confidence in the last uprising. Today, less than half. And progressives have been making a critique of big business, banks, the economic system as not being fair for a generation, while conservatives have been making themselves synonymous with those institutions. There's been a major political realignment around economic issues, which bodes well for progressives. So, this is a Wall Street Journal poll showing 60% of Republicans oppose our NAFTA-style trade agreements. The swing voters who stuck with the Republicans in 2006 but considered voting Democratic were most put off by Republicans' support of trade agreements, unfair trade agreements that cost jobs. That's a post-election poll from 2006. And it goes into other issues. Health care. Polls show many Republicans favor universal health care. Pew's poll in 2005 found 2/3 of the Republican base support a government-sponsored universal health care program. The same poll showed that 3/4 of the Republican Party base supports an increase in the minimum wage. But you don't have to believe any of these data points to know that there is this realignment going on. You just have to remember this guy.
Chris, the first thing we've got to do as a Republican Party is quit being a wholly owned subsidiary of Wall Street and the corporations that have done exactly what Steve talked about, and that is allow workers at the bottom to make money for their companies and then let a CEO get a pension, get a wonderful bonus, take a trip to the Riviera, and Steve takes a trip to the poorhouse. Not many Republicans are willing to say it, but we better say it or we're not going to win another election for a generation. We've allowed a lot of people in the airline industry, the baggage handlers, the ticket agents, the clerks, take 40% pay cuts. The executives steer the company into bankruptcy. They get a $200 million bonus. And it's based not on capitalism. That's a good thing. But this is sheer, unadulterated greed. And that's not what makes a strong economy. And it's going to ruin not just this country, but it's going to collapse the Republican Party if we don't start standing up and saying that you can't have that kind of economy where CEOs make 500 times that of their workers and call that perfectly acceptable. It's not acceptable. We better run for president and remember him and not just the folks who come to the high-priced cocktail parties in Manhattan and Georgetown.
I mean, this sounds like my old boss, Bernie Sanders, right? I mean, it sounds like something I say when I go out and talk about my book. Now you could say, this is Mike Huckabee for those who don't know, the Republican candidate in the primary. Now you could say, well, we don't know there's a realignment going on because he didn't win the Republican primary. Well, I would counter by saying that Huckabee won Republican presidential primaries, the most conservative kind of elections, in Louisiana, Kansas, Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, West Virginia, and Iowa. Not exactly liberal places, or considered super liberal places. Now he was a social conservative, but he was echoing this message in those places. And he won conservative elections in the most conservative states in the country. And then the final thing I think bodes well for progressives in this moment is that we now have an establishment media and a right-wing media that is actually making fun of people's economic plight. So you've got books that come out that basically venerate the super rich and the class war that's going on. And then you've got Fox News, for instance, doing things like this. Watch this clip.
What about these so-called downscale voters that we were talking about earlier with Fred? Fred Barnes has a view that all those who support Hillary Clinton are downscale. And so I think we ought to get Fred to further elaborate on his view that they're all downscale.
Well, when I stop chuckling, look, Mort couldn't explain it, but I can explain to you why we use the phrase working class. It is a euphemism because it's kind of mean to say lower class. It's as simple as that. That's why we call it working class. Everybody knows who we're talking about. We're talking about, Mort, forget it. We're talking about lower class, lower income, less education.
You're not talking about social class, are you?
Yeah, that too.
Really?
Yeah, it means all that.
So you've got a right-wing media that's actually making fun of the day-to-day economic struggles of people. And again, I think this helps push this uprising in our direction. And the last three things I'll say, and I'm going to go through these really quickly, is that there need to be three lessons learned by our side if we're going to capitalize on this. The first is, and I'm going to get into all these, states can circumvent Washington's tyranny of the tiny minority, which Tom taught me about originally in his book, and it's a very scary concept. The rules of the game must be changed. The game is rigged now. This is just a cover of my old book, which I talk about big money in politics. And then we have to remember that elections are not the only way to make change. So, real quick, the tyranny of the tiny minority. What's that? Well, this is the U.S. Senate filibuster as made famous by Mr. Smith. The U.S. Senate filibuster allows 41 senators to stop almost anything. When you think about that, that means about 11% of the population has enough Senate representation to stop anything, and that's being generous, right? Because only about half the public votes. You only need half of the voting public plus one to win. So about 4% of the public has enough Senate representation to stop anything. And so when we focus only on federal politics, we're focusing on the arena that's the most difficult to change, instead of arenas like state legislatures where the filibuster doesn't exist. Now, the right has understood this in their uprising. They funded in a very serious way a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council. Any right-wing policy that's come through your legislature has ALEC's fingerprints all over it. Major conservative causes all started and implemented at the state level. This is why Grover Norquist and Phyllis Schlafly have started and run those state-based campaigns. The right invested in ALEC, and the right integrated ALEC into its entire national architecture. And full disclosure, I'm on the board of an organization called the Progressive States Network, which is trying to do the same kind of thing for our side. But the point here for all of us is to focus in your activism, in your attention, at least some of it, on your state legislature, especially in a big state with a big economy like Illinois. Lesson 2, championing structural reform. I can get into any of these at the Q&A. So, re-legalizing fusion voting. Fusion voting allows small parties to cross-endorse major party candidates on the same ballot. You notice this candidate here is endorsed by both parties on the same ballot. And that basically empowers progressive organizations and small parties in a very, very substantial way. And again, if you have questions about that, we can get into that. Public financing of elections. National popular vote legislation, basically democratizing the presidential election, getting it out of the Electoral College, and there's a fairly easy state legislative way to do that. And then democratizing progressive organizations themselves. You know, the reason why the labor movement has been around for so long and still is among, if not the most powerful progressive organization, is because it is fundamentally small d democratic.